Hello and welcome to this video where the subject is lens corrections. Sounds boring, but it isn't. In an earlier video we talked about global editing, those changes that affect the entire image. We talked about strategic editing, those changes that affect just one part. And we talked about finishing touches, those small tweaks that we may do in Camera Raw or Photoshop to finish the job. We also need to be aware that it's quite rare for one edit of an image to make a massive difference. What constitutes a significant change from start to finish is actually many small edits. It's only when we see a number of small changes together that we start to see the significant changes for the better. Now those small changes can start with lens corrections, particularly chromatic aberration. Now whenever I mention chromatic aberration, I can often see people's eyes glaze over. Now why is it that people seem to be turned off when you mention something like chromatic aberration? Well, I think it's because it's a term that doesn't give you any idea whatsoever in the name what it is or how it affects our images. Most newer users of Photoshop and Adobe Camera Raw might not even notice it at first, but you will in time. Another reason people's eyes glaze over is because suddenly they have that morbid fear that they're standing in front of a nerd. You know, one of those technical people that can speak for an hour on a subject that no one else has the slightest interest in. Chromatic aberration matters because it's one of those small steps we have to make that if we don't fix it at the start, there's a good chance our editing will make it much worse. Now in the last minute or two, you've been looking at chromatic aberration. Let me see if I can remember the actual reason why we see chromatic aberration. I seem to recall, and you can look this up on Google, that it's the inability of the lens to focus all wavelengths of light on the same plane at the same time. So it shows itself in our pictures as we can see here, generally with a magenta and a cyan fringing around dark areas against lighter areas. The good news is it's very simple to fix. I'm going to take you to the lens corrections, which is this option here. When we open this up, we've got two tick boxes here. Remove chromatic aberration is the first one, but before I do that, let me just take you down to the bottom left. You can see that the image is zoomed into almost 300%. So we're quite large on screen, but look what happens when I just place a tick in the box to remove chromatic aberration. How much more simple do we want our manipulation to be? Now I think you'd be very hard to deny that that was pretty impressive. But even if it didn't fix all of the problems, and I would say that 90 times out of 100 it will, then we have a manual setting. We can go to the manual setting and we can take away the color of the magenta or purple fringing and or the green. But most of the time, if we do the automatic profile, it works, I would say even greater than 90%, 99 times out of 100. Now let's test this by zooming into this image shot with completely different lighting conditions. I'll zoom in where the edge here and the ironwork is against the light background, so I'll just click and drag there. We'll get the image very large on screen, and there once again we can see chromatic aberration. The reason we have to deal with it is because later, if we start to push up the vibrance in the image and or the saturation, well, you can see what happens. We just make the problem infinitely worse. Now remember, whenever you're working in Camera Raw, if you move any of these sliders and you want to reset them, just double click and they'll go back to their default position. If I go back to my lens corrections here, and I tick the box, there you can see the entire problem caused by chromatic aberration has been removed. Many of the lenses we use in our photography have known distortion within them. What Photoshop does is applies a profile to correct for that distortion. If we go up to our lens corrections and open them up, even though this image doesn't seem to have a great deal of chromatic aberration, I would still tick the box to fix any that's there, even a small amount. But we're more concerned here with enable profile corrections. Now what's going to happen here? I'm going to tick this little box and you will see the picture change. It's going to pop. Now the way this works is when I tick the box, Adobe Camera Raw is going to use the data that's saved when we shot the image to identify the lens we've used. In fact, it's going to identify the make and the model, and from that it's going to apply the profile. So when I tick this box, first of all you'll see the image pop, but then you'll see what it's picked up in the box below under lens profile. So we're looking at the image now shot with the problems that the lens gives us, and when I tick the box, there it is corrected. There you can see what Adobe Camera Raw's done. It's a Canon lens, 28 to 135mm, and it's applied the profile. Now take a look at the picture and I'll remove the tick a couple of times just so you can get a feel for what it's doing. So there's the lens with the distortion and with it corrected. If I just remove the correction again, if you look at the extreme top left and right of the image, you'll notice there's a tiny bit of vignetting there. I think that was caused by a circular polarizer I had in place on the lens, and I think due to the distortion it's picking up the edge a little bit. But you'll notice that when I tick to enable the profile corrections, it fixes that too. Now sometimes it can lighten the edges and corners of the image when we enable those corrections. We do have a slider down here where we can apply a little bit of vignetting if we wanted to put some of that back. There you can see it. I'll double click to set that back and do it once again. You can see it's pretty measured, but that's pretty typical of the sort of difference we sometimes see, depending on the lens. Now we also have a distortion slider here, but this only sort of measures the amount of the automatic profile corrections we get here. Let me demonstrate by moving that slider completely to the left, and when I tick and untick the enable profile corrections, you can see I'm getting a little bit of change in the density around the edges, which is what I was talking about earlier on, but the image isn't popping. And if I move it to its maximum, then I'm going to get the maximum effect of the enable profile corrections. So it does give you the opportunity, if you've got a number of different lenses, to get to know what setting is best for what lens. Generally speaking, I'm going to suggest that in most cases you probably won't come to that slider. I think that's quite enough correction, and in most cases it does the job for me. But if for some reason Adobe Camera Raw is unable to pick up the lens that you've used and you cannot find it in these drop down menus, let's untick this. If we go to the manual section, we can move this slider either this way or that to get the effect we want. If we have to go a long way to the right, of course, then we've got to consider a little bit of a crop, or maybe we could look at our transform tools, and we'll be coming back to them a little bit later. For now, I'll double click, and there we have lens corrections.